I would like to welcome you to the third annual Transatlantic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific region. We have organized this event in collaboration with the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Brussels School of Governance, and I will invite my colleague Louise Simon of CSDS to offer some remarks shortly. CSIS is very pleased to co-host this timely dialogue to share perspectives on economic and security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region and to identify areas where the United States, together with European and other allies and partners in the region, can coordinate initiatives and further align our respective Indo-Pacific strategies. We have organized two really excellent panel discussions for you today, and we'll kick things off in a moment with a dialogue that I will moderate with two distinguished officials from the United States and the European Union. But before we get to all of that, let me first turn to my colleague Louise Simon, Dr. Louise Simon, Director of CSDS, for some opening comments. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here holding the third edition of the CSDS Transatlantic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific. The purpose here, as Chris was saying, is to discuss how Europe and the United States can work together in the Indo-Pacific alongside like-minded countries, and of course Japan. And we are grateful for the Japanese government's support of the establishment of a Japan chair at CSDS recently. Japan stands out, but also Australia, ROK, and others. We devoted much of last year's dialogue to thinking through the implications of the Ukraine war for the transatlantic agenda on the Indo-Pacific, and I suspect we'll continue to do that today. And my sense is that over the last year or so, and we were talking about this yesterday in a private setting, we've witnessed the emergence and consolidation of a consensus around two important principles. The first is that Russia's assault on the European security architecture must be resisted vigorously. And the second is that China poses a more formidable structural and long-term challenge to international order, right? And it seems to me, I realize that these two principles are somewhat contested, but they seem to be broadly accepted in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, ROK, at least in government circles. A more difficult question, of course, is whether the war in Ukraine strengthens or damages the relative position of the United States and its allies vis-a-vis China in particular, right? And there's been an intense debate here in the United States with some people arguing that a war in Europe poses a big strain on U.S. and allied diplomatic, military and industrial resources and stands on the way of prioritization of China in the Indo-Pacific. But others have underscored the importance of defending key principles of international order and the existence of synergies between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, arguing that the war has actually helped revitalize key alliances in the transatlantic and trans-Pacific, but also revitalize U.S. and allied industrial capacity. So if we look at the Ukraine war through the lens of how it impacts the question of how to deal with China and the China challenge, we can probably all agree that there are both trade-offs and payoffs. But the question is, do the trade-offs outweigh the payoffs or vice versa? And how might a long war impinge on that balance between trade-offs and payoffs? So hopefully we'll have time to address that question here today, especially as it relates to broader debates on trade, technology, security, and so on. That's it from my side. Just to thank you again, Chris, and the CSIS team, and of course Kurt and Gunnar, and all the speakers and chairs. Thank you.
Well, again, good morning, everyone. And to get us started this morning, we have, I think, a really terrific set of speakers. It's my great pleasure to introduce two officials who will help set the tone, provide some opening context for us as we begin the conversation today. First, sitting with me here is Dr. Kurt Campbell, Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the National Security Council. It's impossible to overstate the role that Kurt plays in shaping this administration's Asia policy, and it was my own privilege to work with him. He was previously Chairman and Chief Executive Officer at the Asia Group, strategic advisory and capital management firm, and before that, from 2009 to 2013, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. So thank you, Kurt. And we are also joined virtually by Mr. Gunnar Wiegand, who has been serving as Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific of the European External Action Service since 2016. He is the EU's senior official for the Asia-Europe meetings, as well as for EU-ASEAN relations. And he was also the EU's chief negotiator for the new EU-Japan Strategic Partnership Agreement, as well as several other initiatives, and also contributed to the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific that was released last year. So again, welcome to you both. I appreciate you both taking time out of your busy schedules. So we'll have a brief discussion here, and then we'll try to open things up for a question or two from the audience before we're done. But Kurt, let me start with you. The President is recently back from, I think, what was really a consequential G7 summit in Japan, a summit that featured, I think, many of the themes that you have sought to advance as part of the administration's strategy, these themes of promoting deeper ties both within the region and across regions. So strong messages out of the G7 on Ukraine, also on China, I thought was striking, as well as some side diplomacy related to the Quad, other consequential engagements. I wonder if you could give us an update, sort of a look ahead on the main lines of effort in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and in particular, what areas are there opportunities for deeper cooperation with European friends?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Chris, it's just a pleasure to be with you. I want to compliment this partnership, this pairing. I think it's been extraordinarily important. It mirrors the work that Gunnar has been doing, that I've tried to support here in the United States and in Europe, and it's also a pleasure to be with Gunnar. Gunnar, you look very good on the screen. I want you to know that. You look like a representative of the Action Committee, so I like that, and it's terrific to be with a person who's visionary, who's dynamic, and has really led Europe to think creatively and strategically about the opportunities and the challenges in the Indo-Pacific. So, look, Chris, I would agree with you that I thought that the meetings in Hiroshima were important. And I thought, there were a lot of different things that happened, both as part of the G7 framework, also the visit of President Zelensky, some of the other friends of the G7 joining for parts of the group, South Korea, India, the side diplomacy that took place. But I think the level of common purpose that was demonstrated in both the internal discussions and the joint communique was remarkable, frankly. You alluded to that at the outset, but the agreement on sort of common pursuits, common strategic paradigms when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, both the opportunities here and some of the challenges that are presented, particularly by China, a degree of alignment between the United States, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe of the kind I've not seen before. I will say, been at this a little bit. I've had previous experiences of diplomacy with Europe. Where we are now compared to where we were 15 years ago, we are light years ahead. And the level of intimacy that we interact with on issues associated with strategy, on recent developments, on updates from trips is something that I think we're proud of, but we want to build on going forward. At the G7, the agreement on the challenges that are represented by economic coercion, on certain kinds of debt trap diplomacy, these are things that were in the works for months, but they also reflect, I think, again, a common purpose going forward. I think the hard thing, Chris, when you talk about what's next, is that this is never an arena where you can rest on your laurels or sit back and think, well, that's done with. This is a constant tending, a constant set of exploration with respect to what's next. I think for the United States and Europe, we need to deepen our discussions on technology, both how we support integration and engagement on joint efforts at development, but also how we think about certain kinds of restrictions. I think it's going to be important for us to continue discussions on just assessments. What are we seeing? What's possible? In the past, those discussions had tended to be largely about China, but increasingly, we're talking about other areas of joint engagement, including, the incredibly important role that India is playing, how to work with other countries in Northeast Asia. Almost all countries in Europe are engaging more deeply with Japan, including recent diplomacy between the EU and also Great Britain as well. So I would say that the agenda is full. There is, I think, again, a strong sense. We heard at the outset about how Ukraine what's its impact, and I agree very much that it has cut both ways. It's a demanding set of challenges that we cannot ever forget. But at the same time, to our satisfaction, it has led us, both in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, to recognize the importance of partnerships, the links between the two regions, and the recognition that how one region fares has direct and powerful implications on another.
Yeah, that's clearly one consequence of the war, is the sense that we are deeply connected in ways maybe we didn't fully appreciate before. Gunnar, a similar question for you. What are the key priorities under the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and where do you see potential for more cooperation with the United States and other like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you for this question, and best greetings to all of you, and in particular to Kurt, whom I saw just a few weeks ago in Washington. And I fully agree with him that the degree of detail of information which we are exchanging, but also the analysis about the strategic direction which we need to take when faced with so many challenges at the same time in both theaters, the Indo-Pacific theater and in the European theater, is unprecedented. And I would like to say that the fact that we have twice a year top-level meetings on China and on the Indo-Pacific. In fact, the next one should be in the next few weeks. Also, the fact that the US did participate at senior official level in the recent Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum in Stockholm in mid-May, and this for the first time. This was an important gathering of 60 countries. Where the EU showed also, I think, its convening power. We are having a realization in Europe that we cannot look at specific conflicts in our neighborhood. And unfortunately, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is right next door in a country in the heart of Europe and bordering 4 of our member states. We cannot isolate what happens here from what happens in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think Kurt would agree with this. There were perhaps different strategic schools in the past. There were different specialists for different regions. And the people who were focusing on Europe or in the former Soviet Union were very different from those who focus on China or on the Indo-Pacific in America. And they also realize how interconnected the challenges are. This certainly has helped also Europe to further develop its own Indo-Pacific rollout after the adoption of the strategy to which you referred to. And I want to emphasize that our strategy is one of cooperation it's in the very title, the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So it is an offer for cooperation for all partners from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Islands and from Japan to New Zealand. And it is one which is inclusive. So we work with as many partners as possible where our interests converge, our needs come together. And this is, of course, an offer of cooperation in order to not fall into the geostrategic spheres of influence, thinking of which Europe has been a victim throughout its history. And by bringing together partners, whether it is through the sustainable inclusive prosperity agenda we have, and you will have realized that we have restarted FTA negotiations with India. We have concluded them with New Zealand recently. We are about to conclude them with Australia. We are intensifying with Indonesia. We will resume with Thailand, and hopefully soon also with Malaysia. We are negotiating with Kenya. So there's a whole trade liberalization agenda which goes together with the need for diversification and the need for reduction of critical dependencies or elimination of critical vulnerabilities. We are having a strong emphasis on green transition to tackle climate change, to accelerate just clean energy transition. And we are offering cooperation, and notably with partners in the Pacific, but also in ASEAN. We have entered into just energy transition partnerships with Indonesia and with Vietnam in the G7 context, to which, of course, the US also participates. We work in particular with our Pacific partners on ocean governance issues and fighting illegal fisheries. We work on the digital partnerships with the most advanced partners, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and also try to develop digital trade principles which are binding, again, something necessary in order to diversify our economies and to overcome specific dependencies. And finally, also in the field of connectivity, we are working on many projects under our Global Gateway program. A new area, I guess, is security and defense and human security, where the EU is less known as a partner across the region. But we appreciate the high take-up of our offers for maritime awareness, information sharing solutions, working on counterterrorism, on cybersecurity in particular, and on maritime security. And in the field of maritime security, we also cooperate well with the US. The creation of a new coordinated maritime presence of EU national naval forces in the Northwest Indian Ocean is a new addition which will become fully operational next year. In all of this, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but in all of this, I want to emphasize Europe is there as a partner, yes, as a partner for like-minded partners and as a partner with which have also Indo-Pacific policies, but also for other partners who need to de-risk and who need to diversify. And I want to stress that we have a clear convergence of analysis between Washington and the European Union on the geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges, as was also emphasized by Kurt. Sometimes in certain areas we have different policy prescriptions, but overall we work fully on complementarity of our approaches. And I think this is a very new situation. And to finish with the Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it has been certainly a catalyzer. So some people would have thought that Europe would fall back to its traditional behavior. We have a major crisis in our neighborhood. We all focus on this. Yes, there is a huge focus, and there are many sacrifices done. And 30,000 soldiers of Ukraine are being trained in EU member states, and we are putting billions into, like the US does, into support for weapons and ammunition for the self-defense effort of Ukraine against this blatant aggression. But all member states are fully committed to diversify and to intensify our relations with partners across the Indo-Pacific. And I'm very glad to say, therefore, that we are seeing coming out of age, I would say, of the EU's global projection when faced with formidable challenges both there and here. And we are, of course, acutely aware that from the Taiwan Straits to the Korean Peninsula to the South China Sea and in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, I mean, there are many, many places where the stability and security of this wide region, which has no security order, where it is distinctly in danger, and where instability and insecurity can also veer into open conflict. And we are very pleased that the transatlantic, not only exchange of information, but also the transatlantic coordination and cooperation has qualitatively very significantly improved over the last few years. And I want to thank Kurt for his great work in this respect.
Thank you, Gunnar. That was an impressive laydown of engagement in the region, and I think you both have touched on a number of themes that we'll be getting into in our panels later this morning. Let me turn now to China. I think it's fair to say that both the United States and European counterparts are seeking to find that balance between competing, pushing back on those forms of Chinese behavior that are deeply problematic, indeed threatening to us and our neighbors, while at the same time seeking to stabilize and sustain some level of constructive ties with Beijing that in the end aims to avoid conflict. But I think the Shangri-La dialogue over the last weekend illustrates the challenges associated with that. And as we watch the Chinese defense minister's sort of performance, his speech, his comments on the security environment. Let me start with you, Kurt. What is the way forward in U.S. ties with China in the near term, and the partnership with Europe in managing the strategic competition?
So, first of all, I want to compliment Gunnar's comments. I thought they were strategic, they're right on point, and if you listen carefully and read most of the European documents, they suggest both a deep thinking and a depth of knowledge of the region, a broad approach. You heard him discuss the Pacific, Southeast Asia, the increasing role of India. These are all things that find powerful synergies in the American approach as well. Look, I think it is true that in our private conversations with both, inside government and with European friends, when we talk about Europe, the relationship between China and Russia in Ukraine is concerning. And I think both of us seek constraints on certain activities that China contemplates and wants very much for China to play a responsible diplomatic role in Europe on Ukraine. And I think we are aligned in that approach. What we have seen increasingly are activities in Europe, but also, as you describe, in the Indo-Pacific that are worrying, provocative, and create larger anxieties. And I think our goal is to communicate together in a manner in which we underscore both our commitment to maintain peace and stability, to push back against provocations or steps that are designed to unsettle the status quo or to challenge the operating system that has been established, but at the same time make clear that we're prepared to work responsibly with Chinese interlocutors to problem solve on issues of mutual interest, whether it's climate change or fentanyl or regional security issues like North Korea. I think there are opportunities and there is room for that diplomacy, but at the same time we find, like at Shangri-La, a situation where Chinese interlocutors have basically refused the most basic arenas of consultation with the United States, which are designed to prevent miscalculation, to provide those mechanisms that allow for consultation and dialogue in the event of unintended developments. And as the participants are meeting in Singapore, we have the incident of a Chinese warship conducting an unsafe maritime maneuver against a peaceful transit of American and Canadian ships through the Taiwan Strait. And so some of those messages are indeed jarring and concerning. But I also want to underscore, Chris, this is not an American and European phenomena. In private consultation, almost every country in the Indo-Pacific is concerned by activities that we've seen of late that China is conducting, whether it's border exercises around Iran, activities in the East Sea, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, that are concerning. And so, I mean, I do think that the appropriate response is a consultation to try to align our practices. But it is also the case that I think the responsible thing to do is to always make clear that our door for dialogue is open and that we indeed want to work constructively with Chinese interlocutors, and that this set of arrangements and engagements with allies and partners is not meant as indicators of containment, but rather they are steps to try to secure and stabilize our own operating system that has been so positive and provided such strength and security for decades.
Yeah, certainly agree with you. Your point about this is not just an American perspective. Certainly we hear this across the region from all of our partners. Gunnar, what would be your perspective on these issues, Europe's relationship with China, the role of cooperation with the United States in managing the opportunities, but also the challenges associated with China?
Well, let me first say that, of course, we would certainly have very much welcomed if Secretary Austin would have had a meeting with his counterpart in Shangri-La. And our High Representative, Vice President Borrell, had the opportunity to meet the Chinese Foreign Minister and to convey the clear positions of the EU with regard to our expectations as concerns the potential, I have to say, Chinese role on ending the war of Russia against Ukraine, and our expectations on Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, but also with regard to the South China Sea. The recent visit of my friend and colleague Dan Kreitenbrink and the director of the NSC for China to China, I think is an encouraging signal in turn, because it indicates exactly what Kurt just said, that even if you have many differences, you have to establish channels of real communication at all levels. And we therefore also, of course, very much appreciate the strong outreach of National Security Advisor Sullivan to Director Wang Yi a short while ago in Vienna. It is absolutely crucial that the US and China do establish all channels of communication with each other again, whatever the difficulties may be. The world cannot afford the absence of communication, which can lead to misperceptions and also to dramatic incidents and accidents. We are urging China since last year to play a more active role as a responsible member of the Security Council in using its influence with Russia to stop this senseless aggression and to withdraw the troops from the occupied territories. We are not there yet, but at least there is the contact between Presidents Xi Jinping and Zelensky, and we had the visit of the special envoy to Warsaw, Brussels, Paris, and Berlin before going to Moscow and after having been to Kiev, which is a beginning perhaps of a more active policy. But right now we don't see China going beyond its 12-point position paper. And the key element is, of course, missing, which is the withdrawal of Russian troops from territory it illegally occupied. While the same China very much emphasizes always the principle of territorial integrity under the UN Charter as sacrosanct. This is one of the critical items in the security field and which would have potentially a very negative effect on EU-China relations if there was a support of China for the war effort of Russia, and this was made clear by our leaders repeatedly to the Chinese leadership, including when President von der Leyen recently visited Beijing. And of course, on Taiwan, we have equally major worries. We do believe that we have a clear one China policy and that we have a strong interest in the maintenance of the status quo. This status quo has served Chinese interests as much as it has served Taiwanese, US, European, and other people's interests. Let us make every effort to maintain it. This does not mean that we should deny the right of reunification, but it can only be a peaceful, voluntary, and based on indeed full mutual agreement process. I would like to add to these kind of security concerns and needs to step up efforts for restraint, the economic security considerations, which are important. You know that our ministers recently and our leaders in 2 weeks' time will have a broad strategic orientation debate, and the issue of economic security, to which Kurt referred to when talking about the Japanese and the G7 summit outcome. This is important, that we are not talking about the diversification and the reduction of critical vulnerabilities, which is absolutely crucial. And we have these in particular in areas which are linked to the green and digital transitions of our economies, but that we also look at the diminution of security risks, with inbound investment, where we have introduced a few years ago investment screening into critical infrastructure investments from third countries, as well as into investments into high technology. And we now look into the possibility on how to improve our export control system, as well as possibly introducing an outbound investment control system, which I understand the US may also soon adopt, but strictly based on the clear definition of national security considerations for certain critical technologies. So clearly circumscribed and also country agnostic. These are important elements which are new. There will be a joint communication between the European Commission and the High Representative on this on 21st of June. And we hope that our leaders will give the overall political guidance to work further on this to make possible that relevant legislation would be approved in good time.
Great, thank you for those comments, Gunnar. Just one more question from me, and maybe we'll have time for one or so from the audience. And this is about NATO and the partnership with Indo-Pacific countries. I understand there will be perhaps another gathering of the AP4 leaders, at least some of them, at the upcoming NATO summit. The AP4 being Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. Prime Minister Kish has said he intends to go. I wonder, starting with you, Kurt, if there's anything you can say about what we can anticipate from this year's gathering, but really more broadly, what do you see as the purpose, the objective, ultimately, of this AP4 connection to NATO that is becoming, it seems, somewhat institutionalized.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So look, I think it's fair to say that we are still in very preliminary steps with respect to how NATO considers out-of-area issues. In the past, when NATO had considered issues in the Gulf and in South Asia, those are complex decisions. I think the AP4 mechanism is a useful vehicle, and it's still in a very informal, occasional phase. It's a very good venue to compare notes, to talk about the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. But Chris, I don't need to tell you that when you think about institutions in the Indo-Pacific, you must tread carefully. There are sensitivities that are not just in China, but around the region as a whole. ASEAN is quite sensitive that the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, these are the dominant political and security institutions of the Indo-Pacific, and others that have developed either informal or formal need to understand that the region has settled, at least for now, on that existing framework of consultation and discussion. So I actually welcome very much European interests, either through the EU as a venue or NATO, in exploring and deepening engagement with the Indo-Pacific. But I do think it's important to do it carefully in broader consultation, because in fact, NATO has such a clear exclusive defense and security mandate, and issues associated with security in the Indo-Pacific are delicate, and that's just undeniably the case. And so I think those issues are well recognized by the leadership, but it does not mean that we should not, seek opportunities to consult. I think Prime Minister Kishida has been clear he intends to participate again in the AP4. I think all the other leaders have agreed to as well, and they believe those meetings are appropriate. I will also say that we believe, Chris, that the level of institutionalization in Europe is frankly deeper in almost all arenas, political, strategic, economic, commercial, in Europe than in Asia, than in the Indo-Pacific. And there are lessons and procedures and habits of cooperation that the Indo-Pacific can learn by observing how some institutions function. And so at the very least, I think the educational or the experiential dimension of this cannot be underestimated. And so I think this has been handled appropriately, carefully, not rushing, recognizing that at the first day, consultation is what matters.
Yeah. Gunnar, welcome any comments you might have on this subject, whether on the issue specifically of NATO and the AP4, or more broadly, European defense ties with the Indo-Pacific.
I fully appreciate the wise words of caution and differentiation, Kurt, and it shows also that indeed we have to look at the sensitivities of many partners in the region, and that goes well beyond China. As an EU official, it's always a bit dangerous to comment on NATO. It's the other big international organization in this city, and it is an international organization of which 22 of our member states are member, but 5 are not. So I refrain from commenting on the outreach of NATO to our partners across the Indo-Pacific with the 4 countries you have mentioned. But I would like to say that we are benefiting from it because we have the visit of the New Zealand Prime Minister beforehand, and we look forward to the signature of the FTA between the EU and New Zealand. We have the visit of the Australian Prime Minister thereafter to Brussels, and we also will have a summit with Japan. And talking about Japan, I can say to you that we will step up our security cooperation in significant ways with Japan at that summit, as we have just also agreed at the recent EU-Korea summit. So there is a demand in the region by many partners for the distinct offers for security cooperation, which we as EU, and we are not a territorial defense treaty organization, of course, but we have a growing security dimension of our work, including with partners abroad, and that is appreciated, and that is an additional offer for partners. So this goes beyond and is very different from what NATO does.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's do a question or so from the floor. Maybe over here on the left. There should be a microphone. Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you make your way over here to the microphone. My apologies.
Side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert Delaney from South China Morning Post. I just wanted to ask about I hear what the messages from both sides about how much cooperation we're seeing. But Mr. Wiegand was just talking about these efforts to forge free trade agreements with India, New Zealand, Thailand, a number of countries. And so that appears to be a big part of their strategy, whereas, as we know with the Biden administration, there's quite a reluctance to engage in any discussions about free trade agreements. So this appears to be a bit of a disconnect. And I just wonder if you could comment on that. Is there, at any point, are you going to align strategies in terms of FTAs and agreements like that? Thank you.
Kurt, would you like to?
So I would say I think it's important to underscore that the economic and commercial relationship between the United States and the Indo-Pacific is incredibly robust. Our markets are very open. Last year was the largest trade between the United States and the Indo-Pacific in history. We are still the dominant investor in almost every market in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a situation that there is already substantial openness. And I think while the questioner asked an important question, I do want to underscore that there are many elements of economic interaction that I think the Biden administration believes is critical to address. Maybe not in the traditional way that we saw, for instance, in TPP, but a recognition going forward that secure supply lines, issues associated with critical minerals, issues dealing with climate change, labor standards, things that I think there is a broader recognition have to be included in future economic and commercial arrangements between the United States and the Indo-Pacific. And those are being addressed currently in the IPEF framework. And I think our intention is to roll out both where we are in these consultations when countries gather together at APEC in San Francisco later this year, but we'll also have more to say on things that we'd like to do with respect, particularly in terms of critical minerals. I support the strong commercial and trade ambitions of Europe. And I have seen hardly a week passes when Gunnar and his colleagues are not basically notching up another initiative to deepen ties between the EU and countries across the Indo-Pacific. And I just want to say what I'm struck by is the diversity of countries that have been engaged. In the past, Chris, almost all the discussions and engagements of EU countries has been about China. And now what we're seeing is a much deeper engagement with the key economies of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, obviously India, and also with dominant partners like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So the diversity of their economic engagements and their ambitions to diversify trade and commercial patterns across the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific is something that I welcome and support, and I do think it's complementary to our overall approach.
Yeah, great. Looks like we just lost Gunnar.
He's upset.
Right.
So,
let's do one more, and then we're over time, but we'll do one more.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Kohei Suji from NHK Japanese Public Television.
How are you?
Thank you. I have a question about, China. We're getting a mixed message from China that Secretary Austin was not being able to meet his counterpart in Singapore, while we see Assistant Secretary Kurt is meeting his counterpart, visiting China and meeting counterpart, and possibly Secretary Blinken going to China very soon. And so and your colleague, John Kirby, mentioned that it's more difficult to establish a channel of communication with military rather than diplomatic ways. And if that's the case, could you give us your most updated assessment of why we're getting this two different messages from Chinese diplomatic side and the military side? Is this because of their miscommunication, or they have different intentions? What would be your assessment? Thank you.
Well, look, I would say, just as a general response, that we are still relatively early in the process of this round of re-engagement in terms of dialogue and diplomacy between the United States and China. And it's uncertain what trajectory it will take, but I can assure you what the United States intends. First of all, we will conduct our diplomacy with China in the closest possible consultation with allies and partners. And I think that's how we've undertaken it to date. What we've made clear is that we are seeking a diplomacy with China that is constructive, that is collaborative on issues where we think there is a need for coordination, like climate change. I mentioned fentanyl, a number of other things that I think are of critical importance, issues on the global stage. But I think in the bilateral context is that we believe that the dominant frame of U.S.-China relations is indeed competitive, and that will likely remain the case going forward. But at the same time, we want that competition to remain within responsible bounds, and we want to avert a descent into confrontation. We believe that it is necessary to create the mechanisms of dialogue, of discussion that can deal with unintended or mishaps or lack of coordination in terms of when military vessels or airplanes are operating in close proximity. These are some of the real risks in the current environment. During the Cold War, we were able to construct these mechanisms in a manner that I think led to a degree of strategic stability and confidence. We've been unable to do that as of yet with China. I will note, you will have seen in recent weeks, the Chinese have concluded sort of consultation mechanisms and hotlines with a number of countries, including in Southeast Asia. We believe those mechanisms should also be constructed and engaged in actively and sincerely with the United States. And that's going to be our goal as we go forward. We're going to seek to actually build those guardrails that will allow for greater confidence and send a signal that indeed we want to avoid a new Cold War, which we believe is not in the best interests of either country or the countries in the Indo-Pacific or Europe.
Kurt, thanks very much. This has been terrific. You've been generous with your time. As usual, thoughtful and wise observations. So please join me in a round of applause for Kurt and Gunnar by extension.
And can I just say one last thing? This forum really led the way, and we want this to continue and to continue to diversify. We're hoping that you will develop some
Still good morning for those here in Washington, and welcome to whoever is watching us somewhere. It's a pleasure to continue, and after Kurt's invitation to create workshops, so I'm wondering whether we are already workshop 1. But I think it's much better to delay that for next year and make sure that we get the support which we heard with great pleasure today. So I'm looking forward to next year workshops, and perhaps we can lay the foundation today. It is perhaps significant that the first panel is about economics, because we heard a lot of economics in the discussion between Kurt and my former boss, Wiegand. And I think I will give you just a little bit of context, and then I will ask the panelists to come in. Because somehow we are living in interesting times. And when we are living in interesting times, it always means we are living in a time of crisis. And we are in a situation that an old order seems to fade away, and a new order is not yet here. And I think that always creates tensions. Just a few pointers of the last few weeks. We had, of course, the G7 in Hiroshima, economic resilience and economic security, catchwords. We had another meeting of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, efforts to develop a joint approach to many of these problems. Yesterday, the EU agreed to an anti-coercion tool, which is new for the European Union. As Gunnar mentioned in the introduction, the first ever economic security doctrine will be announced on the 21st of June and hopefully should be adopted by the heads of states and governments when they meet at the end of June. So that would be an economic leg to the already existing security doctrine which we have, which goes by the name of strategic compass in EU speak. I think these are new developments, and it's especially new developments for the European Union. And there, I think the Commission, which is coming forward with it, is working according to the wishes of the European citizens. There is a recent survey where Europeans in 11 different countries, and about 16,000 people were asked, they would not like to see China controlling critical infrastructure in the European Union. 65% against the control of ports, 52% against the control of tech companies, or 58% against the owning of newspapers. So what is the common denominator of what we all see here? Well, I think it is the end of the traditional globalization, which was for years on the growth path. Now we are talking about more control at best, or a fragmentation, bilateralism, or even protectionism at worst. And I think this is the challenge which we have to meet. And I think there the rules aspect comes in, and that's probably the very European approach. There was talk about free trade agreements. Well, we have already the CPTPP, we have the RCEP. Free trade agreements always have strong aspects of rules and standard setting. And I think therefore they are normally a tool which the European Union likes to use, but in both of those, the European Union is not a member of. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was mentioned, is the US approach, but it is below the level of a free trade agreement, which means market access is lacking, the control of the WTO is lacking, and it is more an exercise of like-minded countries, but in terms of security, in terms of rule making and rule setting, I think this is something which we should reflect upon, because we have also to see that there is not a double approach like a crisis response network in the environment of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was also discussed in the G7. So how do these two things fit together? And of course, from the European point of view, we are not a member in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I think there should also be then consultation and discussion. Japan, interestingly, is the link between the three. So is that a possibility for closer cooperation, consultation between the European Union and Japan, having these three agreements in mind? On top, the WTO remains in the doldrums. There's a lot of positive language in the G7, and there's little WTO language when you look in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. So there, technology seems to be more important than trade, but it's a question mark. But we will need a strengthening of WTO against this rule aspect. And the last example I would like to give is where we have to work probably hard, is the data protection in the digital area. Japan and Korea have joined the GDPR of the European Union, whereas between the European Union and the US, there's a different approach to deal with data and with privacy. And I think this is an important area where probably a few workshops will be needed. Well, just to get you started a little bit along these lines, and perhaps I start out with Matthew. Well, I think you don't need an introduction in this house, but just for those who are not in this house, let me just recall, he is Senior Vice President for Economics and holds the Simon Chair in Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Well, my question basically is, I have tried to give a picture. Is, as Kurt told us, the US really ready to consult and to work with the European Union to meet these economic and trade and technology challenges?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Reiter, and I think you framed the issues very well and really made my remarks almost superfluous. But let me just start by saying, I think if you told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting on a panel in 2023 talking about constructive dialogue between the US and EU, I would have been surprised, but sorry, I was gonna say U.S. not that bad. It's not that bad, but constructive dialogue on the Indo-Pacific and with economics at the heart of that conversation, I would have said you're crazy. That's not going to happen. So I think we've come a long way in the last few years. Maybe even 2 years ago, that would have been hard to imagine. So I think the fact that the U.S. and EU are so aligned generally on so many things today that we weren't aligned on before February 24th, 2022, I think is itself really an important backdrop to this conversation, and the fact that we are focused so much on economics. As I say, I've been at CSIS almost 12 years, and in the beginning I was in the back row trying to get my colleagues to pay attention to economics because it was all about national security, and now economics. I'm on stage talking about economics, so I've come a long way myself. So as Michael said, there have been a lot of interesting developments over the last just few weeks with the G7, the Quad, the TTC, lots of alphabet soup of international economic arrangements and plurilateral arrangements. And I'm going to come back and say something about the architecture itself, but in a minute. But just first on economic security itself, which is, I think, at the heart of these conversations. As I wrote in a piece last week, first time, I think, in the G7, the first time anyone has tried to define this slippery term of economic security. And so that was, I think, very useful. They laid out 7 different aspects of economic security, which, supply chain resilience and technology protections and pushing back against China's economic coercion and so forth. I think that was very useful to have that definition. But as Ambassador Reiterer suggested, I'm still a little nervous about this term because at the margins of the term, if you think of it as 2 words, economic security, at the economic end of the spectrum of that term, I'm a little worried that it is sometimes used as an excuse for protectionism, that people think we can sort of call anything economic security in the name of economic security. We can close our markets or offer a favored treatment to our domestic producers and not to others. So that's the concern at that end. At the other end, the security end of the term, I worry that it's an excuse for sort of weaponizing too much economic activity. Some economic activity is risky. It has risks. I think those risks have grown, but not everything in economics is risky, and we should be still thinking in kind of what I think of as negative list terms. That means listing the things that we're worried about and either blocking or mitigating the risks in that area, in those areas, but then letting everything else go. That's the approach that we take to investment policy, to the CFIUS review process, investment screening, and we should still have that mindset that, there's a red area, there's maybe a pink area of risk that needs to be mitigated, and then the rest should be green. We shouldn't do it the other way around, where we don't trust anything unless it's got an absolute protection or it's totally safe. That mindset is the road to perdition, in my view. So that's my general caveat. Let me just say about 2 substantive things within economic security that interest me. One is coercion. So we did a report in March, which yesterday we took it to the U.S. Treasury Department. We're just sort of slowly rolling it out around town. But, we looked at 8 cases of Chinese economic coercion over the last 13 years, from Japan rare earths to Lithuania today. And we concluded that China does this a lot, and that they do it in a way that is sort of informal and low level, doesn't cause a huge economic disruption, but and can be deniable. But against that backdrop, we came up with a counter strategy that is focused more on resilience and relief than on retaliation. Retaliation feels good. China deserves to be punched back, but that's not going to solve the problem, is what we concluded. So we actually are focused more on helping partners and vulnerable countries be more resilient by giving them helping them develop stronger supply chains, helping them negotiate free trade agreements and so forth. And if they're coerced, then giving them relief, which could be a statement of support, which the U.S. hasn't always done. Like the Koreans are still sore that we didn't do that in the THAAD case in 2016-17, or even financial compensation, a small amount to help, as the European Union did for Lithuania, and that was helpful in bridging through the coercive activity. And Lithuania still has that sign on the door in Vilnius today, so they've withstood that coercion. And then the other issue is technology controls. We're probably going to talk more about that, but just to say, I think that clearly that is at the heart of the, as Ambassador Reiterer suggested, I really think that's at the heart of the TTC work. It's really a small t and then a big T in the TTC. And that's for good reason. We decided that we weren't going to fight over Boeing and chlorinated chickens for a while. We're just going to focus on this technology stuff. I think Emily and maybe Shihok are going to talk more about this, but I would just say I think that there is appropriate work to be done individually and together to try to align our appropriate controls on certain types of sensitive critical technologies. That is one of those risks that I think we do need to mitigate. I think you then, having made that assertion, we do need to do that. I think there are a lot of questions around what technologies we need to do it on, in what ways, how far we need to go, and how we align ourselves. And I think there's a lot more still debate and a need for workshops to resolve that. The final point I'm going to make is just actually two, very quickly. I totally agree with you about the rules being at the center of this, even of economic security. I think we need to be doing much more actively to work together to continue to push our preferred rules and norms, and not to concede that ground to others. And so I think we ought to be engaging more actively in real trade negotiations. I mean, between the U.S. and EU, if that's politically possible, but certainly with other partners in the Indo-Pacific. I won't use any of the alphabet soup here, but I'll just say, to me, it's clearly in the national security and economic interests of the United States to be involved in high standard, comprehensive, regional trade negotiations in the Indo-Pacific region, and you can define that however you want. And then the final thing I'll just say is on architecture. Just I want to make sure that everyone has seen and read the speech by our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in late April at Brookings, because it's a very important speech on international economics and does address many of these issues. It's got a lot of good stuff in there, but there's one thing that I really take issue with, which is when Jake says that we need to create a new architecture that is more like a Frank Gehry building than a Parthenon, which the old system was with pillars and so forth. I like the Parthenon, and number one. Number two, I like Frank Gehry, and I agree we have to build new arrangements that are a little strange looking, but Frank Gehry without a foundation is a tent. And so we need to have a foundation, and that foundation is the WTO and the existing system. And so I think that was a fundamental mistake of analysis and policy that comes out of that. So I think we still should be committed, even if it's difficult and yes, it's broken, but that doesn't mean throw it away. We need to fix it and not walk away from it.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was very, very nice picture, and I'm personally very happy how you ended, because in that respect I'm very conservative. Having negotiated the WTO 30 years ago, I would not like to see that this adult is now dying too quickly. And I think one should not throw something away if you have nothing to replace it. So I think that would not be wise. But I mentioned that Japan is an active partner, and within all these three regional agreements which exist or are in the making. So therefore I would like to ask Shoko Goto, Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director for the Asia Program at Wilson Center, do you see a more active Japan now? I mean, Japan has done a rescue operation for the TPP when President Trump left the worst agreement ever. Obviously, that was not the opinion of others. So can we expect here more, and can we expect this trilateral cooperation between the US, Japan, and the European Union?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, first of all, to CSIS and CSDC for inviting me here today. Ambassador, you ask a really important question. I think what is happening is that Japan is taking on a greater role, not just on the economic front, but also politically as well. If I were to describe Japan today in two words, it would be as the global stabilizer. And Japan's vision for achieving global stability has been having an impact on US policy as well. And so, for instance, we look at the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and that was an initiative that was started off with a speech by the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007 before the Indian Parliament. And it was actually embraced under the Trump administration. And of course, President Trump was very hesitant to take on anything that was multilateral or an initiative that was not his own, but this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy did become one of the foundations of the U.S. Policy under the Trump administration, and it's also been furthered by the current Biden administration. And when we look at the G7 statement coming out from Hiroshima, it has become an integral fabric of the G7 as well. And we also see that the Kishida government too, which is in power today, has continued to not just embrace but update that free and open Indo-Pacific idea as well. Prime Minister Kishida was in India earlier this year, and he talked about some of the core principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and focusing a great deal on the inclusivity, including accepting India's political realities of non-alignment, and also really encouraging greater dialogue with China as well, and dialogue for rulemaking, not just on the economic front, but also to deal with cross-border challenges, including climate change, and dealing with global health concerns as well. And when we look on the economic front, as you mentioned, Ambassador, Japan did play a very key role in ensuring that TPP didn't just die with the United States pulling out of an agreement that actually it had played an integral part in establishing initially, but it also made sure that CPTPP thrived and really flourished. And it is also part of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which China is part of. At a time when the United States has been very reluctant to take on new trade agreements over the past few years, Japan has really embraced not just multilateral trade agreements, but also has moved forward with bilateral trade agreements as well. One of the most notable is with the European Union. It was also the first government to reach out to post-Brexit Britain and have a UK-Japan bilateral trade agreement as well. And Japan played a pivotal role in ensuring that the United Kingdom would become a member of the CPTPP as well. And I should also point out that Tokyo is very aware that there is very little appetite in the United States at the moment to move forward with new multilateral trade agreements. But nevertheless, every time a Japanese leader or a senior official comes at a public forum, they always talk about they want the United States to come back to the CPTPP, and that has remained one of their core messages. At the same time, Japan has played a very important role in supporting the United States' efforts to ensure that IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, also flourishes as well. Japan played a key role not just in ensuring that the obvious members like Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia were part of IPEF, but also brought in countries like the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and of course India as well, by focusing very much on the common interests. Which brings me to my second point about common interests regarding China. So both Japan and the United States agree that China is the biggest threat to global economic stability, and they are in alignment to ensure that to keep critical technologies out of the hands of Beijing as well. And we've seen that manifested in a number of ways, and the most recent and most obvious apparent is the partnership between Japan, the United States, and the Netherlands on the export, on agreeing on the export control of chip manufacturing equipment, and Japan will begin implementing those restrictions in July as well. I should point out that Japan's been very well aware of the risks of excessive dependence on China, perhaps well before COVID, well before this whole idea of economic security has come to the forefront. Matt's already mentioned that Japan had been hit hard in 2010 when China banned the export of rare earths to Japan in direct retaliation to Japan nationalizing the Senkaku Islands. And we've also seen, with that, we've seen Japan really trying to embrace ways to have greater domestic resilience and to ensure that it has the ability to push back and fight back. We've seen that in response with the rare earths export ban, greater partnership with Australia to ensure that Japan could get some of the rare earths from Australia, and that's been a win-win situation for both Japan and Australia. But in more recent years, what Japan has done to really institutionalize this is to focus on establishing a legislation as well as a cabinet post in focusing on economic security. I've never actually looked this up, and I should because I keep saying I would and I never do. But Japan says that it is the first country, major country, to have an economic security minister at a cabinet post, and so that is something that is quite notable, and that was in 2021. The following year, Japan came up with its more comprehensive economic security legislation, which appeared, and the outline of that was actually put forward even before the national security strategy, focusing on diversifying supply chains, non-disclosure of patents, maintaining a technological advantage in key sectors, boosting infrastructure resilience, especially in the communications networks. But it is also a mechanism to revitalize and boost domestic Japanese economic competitiveness, and in a means to jumpstart economic growth in Japan, and for Japan to remain essential in the global economy in key areas. That brings me to my final point, which is about the worries, though, that Japan has regarding economic security and its future economic competitiveness. Yes, it is about, there is this alignment with the United States about the advanced technology going to the Chinese. But it's also very worried about protectionism in the United States and some of the contradictions that are appearing from the Biden administration. On the one hand, talking about working closely with allies and partners, and at the same time protecting domestic economic interests at the cost of relations with allies and partners. And that, I believe, is something that Japan shares very much with Europe, as well as many other advanced economies as well. What is interesting is that Japan has taken on some significant moves to protect itself from Chinese economic coercion and the like, but it has also been very careful and more measured in its rhetoric. So in sharp contrast to some of the very hawkish words that are coming from the United States, Japan has really toned it down and had a softer messaging. And that really reflects the bigger Japanese goal of managing risks with China. Japan's goal has never been to decouple from China. It has always been about de-risking and looking forward. The expectation for Japan is to be able to come up with a roadmap for de-risking. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to avoid what Kurt Campbell was talking about, avoiding conflict, war with China, and ensuring regional stability. I think on the economic front, what Japan could potentially lead on is to have some kind of collective economic security mechanism to ensure that there is greater cooperation and coordination amongst allies and partners. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. can just confirm from personal experience, having been posted in Japan first time in '85, that the country of '85 has nothing to do with today's country, and it's quite a tremendous development. And I think what you mentioned at the end, that when it comes to the messaging, I think the EU and Japan are very much in the same boat with the same conviction. I think because both partners have grown from only trade to more politics and security, and I think that shows in the content of the messaging and the way messages are sent. Well, when we talk about Japan, then we always have to talk about Korea. And we are very happy to see that there's a positive development recently, because not talking to each other, that was not only a bilateral problem, but I think also for terms of security. But if we look at common interest, well, then I would point out that Korea is, after Taiwan, one of the main producers, the main producer of semiconductors, but is also engaged in high-end semiconductors. Korea is one of the major producers of cars, like Japan, like Europe, and also the United States. So there seems to be a common interest. Can we create another quadrilateral cooperation here?
Thank you, Michael. I think you want me to answer that question, right? It's a pleasure to be back here. What I find interesting when we discuss this matter that you just alluded to is in think tanks, policymakers, of course, academia, we like to talk about cooperation, right? But when you discuss these matters with business people and they have to think about profit, shareholders, right? The discussion is different. But what I think we have noticed in Europe, in Korea as well, I would assume in Japan as well, and here in the US, is that as we discuss more the concept of economic security, it has become more difficult for businesses to make the case that, you know, we live in a market-driven economy governed by the WTO, international agreements, and more business people have realized that at the very least they have to discuss with policymakers, with politicians, right? If not their investment strategies, but at the very least the economic environment in which they are going to live. So it cannot be taken as a given that we're going to live under WTO rules, because that's not the case anymore. And in a report that my colleague back in Brussels, Raluca Senartoni, and myself wrote last year for a project funded by the European Union that was focused on the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific. We wrote about this technology, digital aspects. And when we're talking to policymakers and business people from the region itself, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia as well, is you notice two things. First of all, in this part of the world, of course, industrial policy is not new, right? Many countries have had industrial policy for a long period of time. So the comment was like, finally the European Union is seeing the light in the way we see it, right? In the sense that industrial policy actually does matter. And I agree with at the point that you were making, right? Some might see this as a positive development, some might not like it, right? But it's a reality, I think, in which we are living, which I think means that the question that you were asking, should there be more cooperation at the quadrilateral level, at even a bigger level, probably we're moving in that direction. That's my impression, at least. And I agree with the point that Shihoko meant, right? There is this criticism, certainly, in Korea and Europe that you mentioned, towards, for example, the US forcing investment here in this country, right? But there's also the reality that this is going to be happening. And the second point coming out from this report from last year is that also from the European perspective, I think there was also a greater understanding that for the EU or Europe to play a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific, it was necessary to adapt to the reality of the region. And this includes the economic reality of the region. And if the economic reality is informed by some of the agreements that have been mentioned, CPTPP, RCEP, DIPA was mentioned when it came to digital, because the idea is that it will grow further. The EU is not going to join these agreements, but it has to understand how these agreements work and how they may benefit, but also have drawbacks for the European Union. But of course, the important role of the US economic role in the region, even if the US is not part of CPTPP or regional agreements, but of course is influencing trade, the digital discussion, and of course technology in the region. And I think that this means that there is going to be more cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. Just today, Korea, for example, issued the National Security Strategy, and when it comes to the European Union, it directly mentions there should be cooperation with the European Union on economic security. Not only, of course, the European Union, a bunch of other countries, US, Japan, as you can imagine, but the European Union is mentioned there. And as you know, having served as ambassador to the European Union, of the European Union to Korea, I think the profile of the European Union has been elevated in Korea to an extent that was not there before, including this area in which, in a national security document, Korea is specifically mentioning the European Union among the partners it has to be working with. On the other hand, I also find very interesting, and this was noted last week, I had the chance to be at the Jeju Forum in Korea. It was very interesting to note how the discussion about the European relationship with Korea, the Korean side has noted that when European leaders go to Korea, and we have seen an increasing number of presidents, chancellors, prime ministers, foreign ministers going to the country, one of the first things they want to do is they want to go to Pyeongtaek, the famous semiconductor factory that Samsung has, right? For example, last year when the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, when he went to Korea, before going to meet Yoon, he actually went to Pyeongtaek, right? Because Spain wants to attract a Samsung factory that Samsung may open in semiconductor factory that the company may open in Europe, right? So he would want it to be in Spain. We, of course, have TSMC doing that in Germany, right? And what I find interesting is that when all this talk that we have about de-risking, and again, linking this to your question, the quadrilateral cooperation that you discuss, I think, is much broader, right? So if you look at Canada, for example, which has very good relations with Korea right now, with Japan, with other countries, it doesn't want to be seen only as the supplier of natural resources, minerals, etc., right? With Korea, when Trudeau was there right before the G7 summit, a couple of days before he was visiting Korea, the Canadian side made very clear that they also want Korea to invest in technology in Canada, right? As an entry point, of course, into USMCA, into this part of the world. And I think from the Korean side is the same. So this interest that we have in Europe, obviously here in the US, to attract investment from the countries reciprocated in the sense that Korea also wants to see investment from European firms, for example, in the country. We saw recently ASML, the Dutch company in the semiconductor sector. It announced over 100 million investment in Korea in research and development, for example, right, in other parts of the region as well. So there's this reciprocity. As I said, these are businesses making basically a business decision, right? Economics-driven decision, but obviously understanding the new political environment. Because in this particular case, in the past, this investment may have very well gone to China, actually, not necessarily to Korea, which is a more expensive location. And the last point, related to the point to the question that you asked about the potential cooperation, is the role of IPEF that I think in Europe we are starting to understand. I think when IPEF was launched, I think in Europe, because we have all the FTAs with different countries in the region, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore. Now we heard New Zealand, Australia are coming next. We thought that IPEF may not be able to compete with the FTAs because there is no market access, as you rightly pointed out. But I think my impression is that it is starting to influence, at the very least, the discussion in the technology sector in the Indo-Pacific region in a way that we have to see how it's possible to Europe to engage with this framework without joining. But for example, going back to Canada, Canada I think is about to join. It has certainly applied to join, so more countries are joining this initiative. How does this affect Europe, but also how may this be able to drive cooperation, right? Because you have all the countries in the region at the very least discussing regulation, technology, etc., and obviously the pool of the US market continues to be very big, and if there's no market access, I think it will influence decisions in the region, and that's something that in Europe we have to understand a bit better now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I should just add, Ramon is such a familiar face for me that I forgot to introduce him. So Ramon is the Korea chair at the VUB, and he is also professor at King's College in London. So just to do justice. Thank you very much. And
same as my wife, actually. So you have to look at this.
Last but not least, Emily, Director of Project on Trade and Technology and Senior Fellow at the Scholz Chair in International Business at CSIS. I would have perhaps two questions for you. One related to your work focused on technology. Does it make sense, and is it possible to try to cut out somebody from technological development? Is that a policy which can succeed, or is it a policy to delay a development? And if it's a policy to delay a development, what should be done during that delay? That's something which works a little bit my mind. I don't have a good answer, so therefore I'm trying to formulate a question. And I think now having listened to all here, you hear from the Europeans, you hear from Japanese, you hear from Koreans, a lot of cooperation. Cooperation and not all-out competition also with China, which we hear in the United States. So is that a positive source of conflict which will create something new? That's the Austrian speaking about Schumpeter, you have to destroy and then you rebuild, or can that be an obstacle? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel today. If Matt got an upgrade from back row, I've gotten an upgrade from back office, and so it's a pleasure to get to be here, especially Matt is one of the best at CSIS, so it's a real distinguished pleasure to be here. That is a very hard question, and I think in order to answer it, maybe we can assess the way that the United States is currently going about pursuing trade and technology alliances. And I think if we look at that, we can kind of see three distinct pillars to the U.S. strategy. The first, of course, is its unilateral toolbox, and that gets somewhat to your first question about export controls on advanced technology. It also gets to the industrial policy pursuits. This is obviously the IRA, which is $368 billion on climate spending, but it's also the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the CHIPS and Science Act kind of all together. If you look at that on climate alone, it's $800 billion in spending just on climate. So that's kind of the core of its domestically centered unilateral toolkit. On export controls and whether or not they're fundamentally a tool of delaying or degrading, I think it depends. There was some news that broke last summer that China had developed 7-nanometer chips, which would have put it, I think, an entire generation ahead technologically than many people had anticipated. And China knew that when the news broke, that controls would be forthcoming from the suppliers of equipment and know-how in order to make these chips. They began to stockpile the machines necessary, and the United States said, oh my gosh, they're stockpiling these machines, let's control. Because it turned out the capability that China had to make these 7-nanometer chips actually was probably stolen from another foreign producer and that they couldn't produce them at scale. So what that means is that according to the United States, there was a small window where they could still be prevented from obtaining this very advanced technology at scale in the near future. So what ensued, as Shihoko mentioned, is this kind of odd trilateral arrangement, which I think if you actually look at it is more of two bilaterals between the United States and China and the United States and the Netherlands to get everyone marching in the same direction on export controls. Another good question is whether or not that's something that can be replicated in the future. This was extraordinarily intensive from a diplomatic perspective. I was speaking to some people at BIS who run the thing, and they said, yeah, we spend 100% of our time on Russia, and we spend the other 100% of our time on figuring out what this weird trilateral is. And I think that kind of tells you a lot about some of the drawbacks of pursuing the more unilateral-based toolkit. A second big pillar of the way the United States is going about this pursuit of new tech and trade alliances is in the friendshoring agenda. In friendshoring, I think Janet Yellen was the first one to use that 2 summers ago, basically means encouraging companies and countries to move supply chains out of countries that could pose a national security threat. It begs a host of questions, well, who's friendly? And this also actually, in my opinion, goes back to export controls. You don't really want to pursue next generation emerging tech investments in a country where you think that tech could potentially flow out to an adversary. And so already you kind of have to lay the foundations for, are you a trustworthy partner? If we invest in a quantum facility in your country, do we know that that won't harm us in 10 years? The same goes for AI, probably on a shorter time frame. The third pillar is really these bilateral and multilateral arrangements. And I think we see kind of the embodiment of this new tech and trade agenda in both the G7 and the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. I think Matt's characterization of the TTC as little baby, small t for trade and the big T for technologies is absolutely accurate, but it really does highlight the US desire to forge ahead and lay standards and kind of foundational frameworks for new technologies like quantum, AI, biotech, and so on. I think one thing that's important to note about the TTC in particular is that if we look at IPEF as sort of the replacement for CPTPP, it's having formal rounds. We just had a ministerial in Detroit. There are very concrete pillars that are being negotiated, environmental trade, digital trade. The TTC was never really intended to replace TTIP. It has a completely different function, and it's mostly consultative. I think another important feature of the TTC is that we tend to take for granted that it will continue to exist as is, that in 10 years we'll still be having these cooperative arrangements with the European Union, and maybe we'll get a new quantum facility out of it, maybe not. If you look at the political realities in the United States, we have a huge election upcoming. The European Union also has major elections around the corner. And so I think if you zoom out a little bit, it deserves a grain of salt to assume that we will just have the TTC in a couple of years. I think perhaps a better way of thinking about it is a Netflix miniseries where there are 6 episodes. In that case, we've already had 4. It makes sense with the electoral timeline that we would have a couple more rounds. But if that is the case, and I don't know that it will be, we really need to get serious about delivering concrete outcomes. And the one kind of shining example of where friendshoring has really succeeded is Japan with this Rapidus project. IBM also made a new quantum facility announcement at the G7. The TTC is very well suited to have those concrete outcomes come out of the TTC, but we haven't quite seen that emerge. And so that's something that we'll probably have to change going forward. If I could just wrap up with, you mentioned earlier the WTO language in the G7, and that struck me as well when I was reading the earlier draft from April, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is really, I like this is good to read about the WTO in a G7 statement. But I also thought, wow, the Americans must have really conceded to have that much WTO language for just a couple of sentences on an outbound investment screening, which was kind of a tepid endorsement by their partners. So just kind of a funny observation. But if we look at what comes next, I share Matt's reservations about the need to maintain our strong foundations, and the WTO isn't necessarily suited to deal with some of these tech and economic security issues. But I think where there is a lot of promise for the WTO is on climate change mitigation policies. I, for one, don't think that we have time to start over. Climate change is really urgent. I mean, if you walked here like I did today, it's extremely smoky. The WTO has to play a vital role in international trade, and the best example is making it easier, cheaper, and more efficient to exchange goods and services that have a climate change mitigation effect. So it's easy to kind of focus on the scary things like AI and quantum, but we have a real opportunity to get it right, and in so doing kind of reaffirm the multilateral trading institutions.
Well, thank you. American friends are all at the end always very friendly and saying something positive about WTO. Before I go to the audience, anybody wants to react to somebody on the panel? Total agreement? Matthew, you are shaking
There's so
your
many
head.
good points made by everybody. I basically want to agree, but just maybe to take the sort of technology issues, you asked a question at another forum yesterday that we didn't have a chance to kind of pick up on, but about, exactly whether the October 7th, the second important date in 2022, in addition to February 24th, was October 7th, when the U.S. imposed these unilateral controls on high-end semiconductors and equipment. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were asking a good question about, the national security rationale for that action. And I do think that that is a good question. It is important to answer that question because, in my view, and it goes back to my point about this sort of spectrum of economic security activity, that, we need to be able to justify intervening into, business activity that is legitimate with, on the basis there's an actual, pressing national security concern. If not, we really need to be questioning whether we should be interfering. And this has implications in more practical terms for, the kinds of chips that Korea sells, for example, which, are those problematic or aren't they? So this is something where, it's both a comment, but trying to evoke an answer from Emily as well, that I think this is where the US and EU in particular need to have some harder talk, because you have an EU member which is obviously central to the October 7th measures, but you have, others, including your, I guess you're Austrian, right, not German. Apologies for that common mistake. But Germany is also an important player. Austria probably is a player in semiconductors in a way that, actually that's an important point itself, that the supply chains for these things are so complicated that a lot of countries are involved in this story one way or the other. So it's important, not
concrete data and information on the risks of over-relying on a single marketplace. And I think the United States is under a lot of pressure right now to kind of make some of that decision-making a little bit more transparent. The only other element that I would add is the reciprocity factor. And it's very important that we ramp up our information sharing with allies so that they know where we're coming from. But we also need to remember that trade agreements, technology agreements, are fundamentally reciprocal. So we need to be willing to make certain concessions, or at least to provide additional incentives. And so I try to kind of characterize moving forward as how we build in additional reciprocity, particularly from the United States side and outside of hard security measures.
Okay, thank you. We'll have another 5 minutes to wrap up in time. Yes, I think we have to walk to the. It's good for health.
Two quick questions. The first, very simple. Do you think there's going to be a complete decoupling in tech between China and the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, or is there an option that is not? And the second one, all these issues that we've been discussing, anti-coercion, export controls, etc. Is there any way that they could be made WTO compatible if it's not through the national security clause, which basically means I can do whatever I want? So is there any way to make all these new things compatible with a new WTO or reformed or whatever? Thanks.
Okay, who would like to take it? I just say one thing. Those who have worked in the WTO talking about national security interests, we call that's the nuclear bomb of trade policy. So one has to be very careful with that. Having said that, who wants to pick it up, the question?
I have a thought, but let's let Emily go first.
On decoupling, I think probably not, and that's just by virtue of how complex, like Matt said, a lot of these supply chains are. I mean, if you look at just an analog chip, a kind of clunky big one that goes into your car, for example, or actually this is kind of funny, we had one of the leading chip makers from Germany in town here at CSIS in the building, and we have these automated trash cans where you wave your hand and it pops open, and he was like, oh my gosh, what a wasteful use of a chip, especially during a shortage. But even with those types of chips, they have thousands of components, including silicon that comes overwhelmingly from China. And so to be able to decouple sufficiently is probably not feasible, at least within a decade. I also think that the administration, for all of this rhetoric about de-risking, and same with President von der Leyen, they do not want to decouple because it is so tricky. And there aren't really a lot of good, viable alternatives for chip manufacturing. India is obviously trying to play a greater role, but there are very persistent and concrete problems that will prevent that from happening, like a consistent electricity supply or water shortages. Chip manufacturing is extraordinarily water intensive. And so for now, it looks like we will probably maintain a lot of those open ties. I think the one exception on emerging technology is probably quantum, because there are 5 to 7 different modalities for achieving advanced quantum outcomes. Each of these are vertically integrated supply chains, so they're kind of happening in big silos. China's doing its own thing. They're developing their own quantum supply chains. Same for us, same for Finland, same for Germany. And so we really don't have a viable global ecosystem yet. And what that means is that supply chains are much simpler for the time being. I think that'll probably change as the technology matures, but that could be one area where we just never end up integrating. And whether or not that's decoupling is sort of a separate question.
Okay, Ramon and then Matthew.
Yes, I mean, I agree, but I would introduce a caveat, which is, if you look at the level of investment in high-tech sectors in China, it's really coming down, right? And then you see growing investment, obviously, here in the US, in Europe as well, Korea, Japan. I mean, I think Samsung just announced investment in Japan, for example, right, for a R&D facility, I think it was. So they are discussing it. So it seems that in very high-tech sectors, without decoupling from China, which I agree, I don't see how it can happen, but you can see how companies are moving away from investing in China, right? And we're discussing one of my latest visits to Korea, the green shipping sector, because Korea produces around 70% of the green ships that we will need to use if we want to move into a green economy, right? And they're trying to source as few components as possible from China, whereas if we hadn't the current situation in terms of confrontation with China, probably half of the components would have had some Chinese, they would come from China, or China would have been involved somehow, right? And you see these big Navy firms saying, okay, we have to source from somewhere else, even if it is more expensive, because it will be more expensive to source from, they were looking at Japan, they were looking at Europe, they were looking at Australia, Canada, different places. It's more expensive, but they feel they need to do it, and they're actually doing this to the detriment of China without fully decoupling from it.
Just a quick word on both questions, or in each question. Totally agree with Emily that, and I guess Ramon said the same thing, that decoupling broadly is impossible. I do think sometimes that at least some people, when they use the term de-risking, are being a little disingenuous, because they are actually trying. I mean, if you read it on face value, the earlier Jake Sullivan speech in October last year, I mean, he said we're basically trying to kick China off the ladder in this space, at least, which sort of felt like an attempt to decouple. You call it something else, but that's sort of the attempt. Whether it's going to work or not is a much different question, and I'm very skeptical about that. But I do think that some of the rhetoric on de-risking is actually masking, some impulse to try to decouple, at least in some areas. I still prefer de-risking to decoupling, and I think that is the bigger imperative. But I just make that point on the WTO thing. I mean, I think the national security provision of the WTO is very important and is going to realistically always be there and always be available to be used. And it's why the United States and Europe in particular need to be very careful about how they deploy that exception and not give others an excuse to to use it. Because if, like me, as I said, you believe the WTO still is important, it's very important to be careful about how we use that and to justify what we do on genuine national security grounds. And just one final thing, because you said coercion too. Australia was coerced after it had the audacity to call for an international investigation of the origins of the COVID-19 virus, and its barley and wine, among other things, exports to China were cut off. Australia filed WTO cases on those two products, and those are, I guess, still technically pending. But in the deal that Australia did with China for China to remove the restrictions on those products, Australia agreed to suspend those two cases. That suggests to me the WTO has more power than some people think. I mean, it's clearly China cares. They don't want to be shamed in the public space. They don't want to have a WTO case. They want to present themselves as good global citizens when it comes to those organizations. I think that's a really interesting case study of the power of the WTO still.
Yoko?
Yeah, I know we're quickly running. We've already gone beyond time, so very quickly. Very quickly. One, I agree. The goal for Japan and the European Union, Europe more broadly, has never been about decoupling, and so I think we don't really need to talk about decoupling as an end goal, especially now that the United States is taking on this language about de-risking as well. But we also do need to be mindful of the fact that we're not operating in a vacuum, that China has its own strategy, the dual circulation strategy, to become more resilient to the isolation and containment that it is facing, and what policies they take, how they are going to actually be this self-contained unit is also something that we should be mindful of. On the WTO, I think one of the things that we do have to kind of step back and remind ourselves is that what is the end goal here? And we've seen a great change in the trade landscape. The United States and Japan, until quite recently, one of their biggest source of friction was trade. And now trade rules are actually one of the things that is bringing them together. And so when we look at that reality, I actually I don't actually totally play down IPEF. I think IPEF that the United States is pushing forward is good in focusing on some of the new trade concerns that we have about supply chain resiliency and about having to coordinate and cooperate on issues like sharing information in times of disruptions that are caused by natural disasters or economic coercion and the like. But the challenge is going to be able to expand that and have greater buy-in so that it is effective and not simply ending in rhetoric. Thanks.
Well, I think this question gave the possibility to everybody to make comments, and I'm trying to wrap up in time. We have taken 5 minutes overtime, but we started with -10, so it's actually not so bad. I think what the discussion shows us that policy making in trade and economics is a rather tricky issue, because at the basis companies from Europe, from Japan, from the US, from Korea are competitors. And what we are trying to do on the political level is to make rules and regulations, and they should provide this level playing field. But it depends what ideas you have and how the level playing field should, in which direction should it go, and how, at which level it is. And I think this is the challenge. One example, just Micron, sanctioned by China, can create a lot of problems because will somebody else step in? So policy making is not easy, but coming back where we started, we need more seminars, and with compliments to Kurt, we are looking forward. And so please join me in giving a hand to the panel.
Okay, so we are already running behind our schedule, so let us dive straight into our second and last session of today. I should probably start by introducing myself before introducing the panel. So my name is Eva Pešová. I run the Japan chair at the CSDS, and I'm one of the culprits behind this dialogue for the last 3 years. So yes, if you have any complaints and praises directed to me and to our colleagues here at CSIS that I want to thank very much publicly. Nick, thank you, and all your team and the Japan chair team here for their amazing welcome and hosting. This session is supposed to look at nothing lesser than cooperation, transatlantic cooperation in security and defense. So it nicely builds up on what we heard this morning in the opening session and also in the previous session. Obviously, we have heard about the deeply transformative effect of the war in Ukraine, in a way a positive one, for the level of transatlantic cooperation, for revitalizing the kind of US-led democratic alliance-based system, for revealing the deep interconnectedness between the European and the Asian security theater, but also for bringing our Indo-Pacific partners closer on board. So it opens a unique momentum in a way that we have to think of how to best leverage to make the most of this cooperative momentum to ensure peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. I must say that when we started this dialogue 3 years ago, the idea was to simply open the channels of communication. We sensed that there was a niche. We sensed that there was a need to go a little bit deeper in those transatlantic coordination beyond China, because that was the time that the TCC started, and there was nothing much that we really discussed in a more kind of organized, institutionalized fashion. So here we go. I couldn't have hoped for more and better than an endorsement by Kurt Campbell. I think it adds a new energy into this dialogue that we take very seriously. And I'm hoping, I'm already starting to think about the 1.5 working groups. So I'm going to, pick the brains of our colleagues here as well on that. But I'm happy to be here with an outstanding panel, lineup of experts that I wouldn't have hoped for, starting with Chris Johnstone, who you have seen already quite a bit during this dialogue. Thank you, Chris, for being here. Chris is the Japan chair here at CSDS and senior advisor on Asia. Yuki Tatsumi, who is the director of the Japan program at the Stimson Institute. Jeffrey Hornung from the RAND Corporation and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And last but not least, my partner in crime from the CSDS Japan chair, Céline Pajon. And I'll start with home turf, Chris, if I may. We have heard from Kurt and Gunnar this morning all the praises, all the good things about the transatlantic cooperation. It seems that everything is going smooth. We are all on the same line. We are happy to continue this cooperation. You have spent over 25 years, if I understand correctly, inside the American establishment. This seems to be rather new. Everyone has agreed that we wouldn't have expected this level of closeness that we have now 5 years ago. Do you think it's going to be sustained? What do you see as potential obstacles from inside, perhaps? And what would be even the priority areas where we could focus? What's the likely and the less likely where we could match?
Thanks, Eva. It's really a privilege for me to be here too and to meet colleagues from Europe for the first time, also fellow Japan watchers. So thanks very much. I'll make maybe a few minutes of remarks and try to get at the answer of your question. Let me first start by picking up on something that Kurt Campbell also said this morning, and that is, obviously here in the United States, there's a heavy focus on the security environment in the Indo-Pacific, the challenge posed by China, and pretty deep concern about the revisionist behavior that, at least from a Washington perspective, that we see. I think it's important to underscore what Kurt said, and that is that this is not just an American view. U.S. allies and partners in Asia express this view too. If you look at the Japanese National Security Strategy, they describe, that was released in December of 2022, they describe the security environment as, quote, the most severe since the end of World War II. The Korea Indo-Pacific strategy released earlier this year says that, quote, stability of the regional order is being increasingly eroded. The Australia Defence Strategic Review that intended to inform their defence planning says that these are the most challenging circumstances in our region for decades. So there is this sense, I think, across the region that, not just in the United States, that China is the pacing challenge, that there are deep concerns shared about revisionist behavior, and that cooperation is needed to address it. This is, of course, a response to China under Xi Jinping, the increasingly aggressive foreign policy that we see out of Beijing, the alignment with Putin, particularly over the war. Number of countries across the region have experienced directly and are experiencing today coercive pressure from the Chinese. Japan, of course, it drops out of the media quite a bit, but day-to-day pressure on the Senkaku Islands by the China Coast Guard. The ROK experienced coercion related to the deployment of a missile defense system, the Philippines, and related to the South China Sea, and of course Australia, which actually experienced direct interference in the political system. And also, of course, is the pressure that we've seen from China on Taiwan, most specifically evident in the August 2022 exercises and the military activities around Taiwan at that time, and the missile launches into Japan's EEZ, et cetera. Now, it's important not to overstate all of this, right? I mean, it is my view that the likelihood of a major conflict over Taiwan is low. The Secretary of Defense said last week that conflict is neither inevitable nor imminent. All of us, Europe, United States, Japan, others in the region, are seeking to stabilize their own ties with Beijing, to find the balance between competition and addressing objectionable behavior while sustaining economic links. But the deterrence challenge is real, and in my view, Europe has a real role to play in sustaining, reinforcing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. We heard a lot from Kurt Campbell this morning about the very thin nature of U.S.-China military-to-military communications, that as other parts of the U.S. government are seeking to engage, the mill-mill channel remains ice cold, and that is certainly cause for concern and raises, I think, the risk of an incident. So there is clearly a European role here, I think. The Biden approach, as all of you know here, has been to focus first on alliances and supporting more capable allies as well. It's not just expressing a love for our allies, it's about supporting actual new capabilities in those allies. And we see that evident in support for strike capability in Japan, support for nuclear propulsion, nuclear-propelled submarines in Australia. So the focus on more capable allies. And in fact, I think you could make the case that really for the first time, at least since the Cold War, all of U.S. major alliances in Asia, with the exception of Thailand, which is a slightly different case, are getting stronger at the same time. The U.S.-Japan alliance, U.S.-ROC, U.S.-Philippines, U.S.-Australia, all getting much stronger, and significantly relationships among them. So Japan's relationship with Australia, Japan's relationship with the ROK, with the Philippines, that these relationships are organically becoming stronger as well. So what's the European role in all this? And I do think, Eva, to answer your question, I think clearly we've made a lot of progress in I think converging our perspectives on the challenge, but I think it's also clear that there's more work to be done. I think one of the real lessons of the war in Ukraine is that a global response to aggression is critical and has an impact. The fact that Japan has played such a significant role in the sanctions and cost imposition on Russia, and the support for Ukraine is very significant. It helped to bring along other Asian partners into the effort. And while we didn't succeed in deterring Russian aggression, I think we have been successful in significantly degrading the Russian economy and the Russian military. So we should think about how we take the same approach in Asia. We need to send the same message to China and North Korea, for that matter, that aggression will be met with the same kind of global response, and that Europe will be part of that global response, both economically and, to the extent plausible and practical, militarily as well. And that partners who are coerced will be supported. Very promising that the G7 had this as a theme in the standalone statement. But we should do more thinking about how we prepare now for a crisis over Taiwan, a crisis in the South China Sea. We had the luxury of time in the run-up to the Russian invasion, time to prepare the kinds of measures that we collectively had ready to go on February 24th. We have to assume that we won't. We may not have that kind of time, and therefore the thinking among all of us about what are the steps that we, both in the economic realm as well as in the diplomatic and military realm, what are the steps we can take together to promote stability and deterrence. Lastly, I would just say that presence matters, and I think what we've seen of the elevated engagement among a number of European partners in the defense space in Asia, I think is welcome. The deployments of 2 UK ships sort of on a permanent basis to the region, the German deployment, I believe last year, French deployments to the region, all these I think are positive. I wouldn't argue that they make a huge contribution to deterrence, but they signal interest, signal solidarity with like-minded partners. And another area where I would suggest that perhaps there's cooperative work that we could do is in security assistance. The needs of Southeast Asia and South Asia in terms of capability to defend their sovereignty, to monitor their maritime spaces are vast. There are existing efforts underway, but I think European partners would bring a lot to the table in terms of supporting capability advancement. At the risk of having gone on too long, I'll stop there.
Not at all, and we can always get back to it in the next round. But I fully agree of the signaling, and Europe is trying to do a lot of it, and we have been really investing a lot in our cooperation, as Gunnar was saying earlier, with Japan, with other East Asian partners. With Japan really being the kind of main partner that we go to and that we step up cooperation with. I'll turn to Yuki now for the Japanese perspective. You have clearly noticed this increased amount of interest on the European side. How is it perceived? What is the Japanese expectations of not just the European, but also the kind of transatlantic role in the region? What is there to get from it?
Thank you, Eva, and thanks again for CSIS and the CSDS for giving me this opportunity. I would try to answer to your question in a kind of a indirect manner. I would just start by saying that Japan's expectation of NATO, or writ large Europe, is, I think I very much agree with Chris, that, for example, in any kind of a kinetic contingency situation in East Asia, I don't think Japan expects Europe to come to fight with us, for the lack of better words. However, from the peacetime, Chris talked about it, and Kurt also talked about it in his our opening session about messaging. Strategic messaging by these deployments of European partners in terms of naval presence is very, very critical, and I think that is the part that Japan appreciates very much welcomed by them, and then also continue to welcome such actions. As we all know, free and open Indo-Pacific is the phrase that first brought up by late Prime Minister Abe. And then I think I would argue that Prime Minister Kishida add his own spin to it, So I think when late Prime Minister Abe was thinking about this concept, he really talked about the convergence of two oceans, and he talked about India and the Pacific Oceans. And I think when Prime Minister building up on it, I think he's now really connecting another ocean, which is Atlantic. And it is at his Shangri-La dialogue, he talked, when he delivered a keynote last year, he talked about Ukraine today can be tomorrow in East Asia. And I think that really sums up where he really would like this free and open Indo-Pacific concept go. I think he really is trying to situate this free and open Indo-Pacific concept and what that concept stands for. Respect for rule of law, no use of force for no coercive use of force, to change a status quo unilaterally, so on and so forth. Really possibly as one of the key organizing principles for global security moving forward. And I think in that endeavor, relationship with Europe is quite critical. So, in terms of bilateral, Japan already have quite robust, starting to have a robust defense relationship with some of the key NATO allies, and also with together with in the context of U.S.-Japan alliance, we already have the burgeoning U.S.-Japan-UK partnership emerging, and with NATO, I would be very, very looking forward to see the updated partnership for cooperation partnership program that Japan is now discussing with NATO, and depending on the end result of the whether NATO can overcome French president's opposition and then actually can bring the NATO liaison office to Tokyo, I think that will also be significant. So I think I'll just stop there because I know there will be another round.
Thank you very much, Yuki. And you just created the perfect bridge for me to ask Céline, who happens to also be the head of the Japan program at IFRI, the French Institute for International Relations, to chip in a little bit on the European, but also on the French perspective. I mean, this is something that we discussed informally, but it's probably in the minds of many. We know how France is important and instrumental in this outreach. So what would be your take then?
Thank you very much, Eva. Thanks a lot for having me here. I'm really enjoying my time. It has been a tremendous, interesting discussion here. So yeah, I will mostly focus on the EU and European, and then I will add some words on French, if you allow me. I was asked to look at the convergence and divergence between Europe and the US about security environment and Indo-Pacific and how can cooperate then. So I will briefly highlight the convergence that I see, and I will echo a lot of what we have been said this morning and was also Chris said about the fact that both European and American today acknowledge the central importance of the EU Indo-Pacific region. Now there is a recognition that the two theaters of transatlantic and Indo-Pacific are interconnected, and the war in Ukraine certainly highlighted that, and not least by the Chinese tacit support to Russia. And of course, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, China is mostly at the center of the discussion. And in recent years also, we've seen a convergence in the threat assessment regarding China, especially in Europe after the COVID crisis and the episode that we had with the wolf warrior diplomacy, the crackdown on Hong Kong, the tension in Taiwan Strait, and so on, and especially with economic and political also coercion by China on Europe. We've seen strong degradation of the Chinese image in the area. And so I think the recent very important speech by Ursula von der Leyen on China in March is a testimony of the more realist approach that we have in Europe, seeing China more these days as a systemic rival and a competitor rather than a partner, even if the partner part is still very much here. Another element of convergence we've seen the Biden administration that has based is Indo-Pacific strategy on the cooperation and engagement with allies and partners, and especially there have been a lot of reaching out to the Europeans to support the China and Indo-Pacific strategy with the US. And quite recently, we've seen a softening also on the US rhetoric on China, and we've heard that this morning, trying to re-establish a channel of communication to avoid any incident. And also the convergence of, at least in the terminology with the US administration, talking more about the de-risking strategy rather than the decoupling, and the G7 communique is also a testimony of that. So despite this convergence, I think the divergence and differences of views and approach and capability between Europeans and Americans on security contribution in Indo-Pacific remain. And so it's important to look at that too. So of course, the Indo-Pacific and China, it's not the same level of priority for the US. China is number one priority, and the Europeans are well aware of that. But for the European, it's another story. It's very important, but it's not vital. And also, we need to recognize that within the EU, within the Europe, there is a diversity of views on China and how to engage with China. Also for the Europeans, Indo-Pacific is broader, and Indo-Pacific strategy is broader than China. It's not all about China. It's about upholding a rules-based order and stability, and I think stability is a key word here. And from the European point of view, a very tense US-China rivalry is part of destabilizing factors in the region. So the Europeans' approach is inclusive and not try to fuel tension, especially the bilateral tensions between the US and China, and want to mitigate the great power competition. I think another difference is that Europeans also view the question of security in the region not only as hard security. Being in Washington, we are talking a lot about hotspots and coming tension or friction in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. But there are more about security in the Indo-Pacific, actually, what we call the soft security, non-traditional security, transnational threats. It's a strong also destabilizing factors in the region. Just think about the climate change and the multiplication of natural disasters and the risk that is posed on migration also in the region, the loss of biodiversity, crime at sea, and so on. So not all is about our security, and I think it's also the role of the European to try to put that on the table. Finally, of course, European and American do not have the same capacity to act for the security in the region. In Europe, there is a limited military capacity. EU has no full-fledged armed force, and only few countries, such as France, Germany, and the Netherlands, can deploy naval assets to the region, and Air Force also assets to the region. It's, I think, very important as a political signaling It's very much welcomed by all our partners in the region. And just to add that we are not only sending frigates in the region, but recently France have been also sending some nuclear submarine there and intelligence gathering ship in the Taiwan Strait. So it's quite significant. But the EU as a whole has limited military capacity, but it doesn't mean that it's not a significant security actor, especially in the Indian Ocean, so Western Indian Ocean. Just think about the Atalanta operations that have been going on since 2008, and tackling the piracy operation, and also contributing to maritime capacity building of our partners in the region. Taking all this point into consideration, what kind of cooperation or coordination would be possible, or can we push between the US and Europe? Coordination can mean different things. It can mean complementarity with the US. And then, again, security and stability is not all about security and flashpoints. So about transnational threat, I think the EU has a solid experience and expertise to offer to its partners in the region. And it can bring a nice complement to a more militaristic US approach to the region. We can think also about a kind of geographical division of labors. The European definition of the Indo-Pacific is broader than the American one. The American one doesn't look at the Western Indian Ocean, actually, and it is actually the strong asset for the European. So we think that it is closer to home. We have experience, and we can do a lot in this region. Cooperation and coordination is also about synergy, but synergy and convergence do not mean alignment. I do think that EU and US should consider associating on some initiative, especially on, we're talking about maritime security, but on MDA, maritime domain awareness. The EU do have several programs, including CRIMARIO, that is building capacity in the region, and the US has led a Quad Indo-Pacific initiative on MDA. So that would be interesting to look at how we can articulate, we can coordinate, we can join force on this kind of initiative. Without maybe the US requiring a full political alignment when it's not necessary. I would say a few words about Taiwan, just to end. I think there is no appetite from the EU side to meddle in the conflict over Taiwan, but there is a strong interest to prevent any crisis in the region. And for that, I think it's very important to send a clear and consistent signaling to China, reaffirming the opposition to the change of status quo by force, and make clear also that any aggressive move by China would be costly. So there is a need indeed to coordinate over what kind of possible sanction or and reaction we could oppose to complicate the calculus of China. And maybe two words on France, and maybe related to NATO, because I think if we want to have a more granular discussion on this issue of transatlantic cooperation, we should reflect on what kind of level we are talking to. We are talking about the US EU member states, or US EU, or a kind of cooperation within NATO. And here, of course, there is a diversity of view also. among the NATO member states regarding what the alliance can do in the region or with the partners in the region. And France has a very conservative interpretation of the Transatlantic Treaty. So I think we should understand the latest comment by Emmanuel Macron about opposing an opening of an office, NATO liaison office in Tokyo in this perspective. I think it's the liaison office is not a big thing. I think it would be actually very useful to just coordinate views with the AP4. I think Emmanuel Macron is very cautious, and he has repeatedly said that he doesn't want to provoke China. So I think he's saying that, saying like France do not want to provoke China. I think he's quite also maybe upset about the fact that there have been some leaked information about this NATO liaison office in Tokyo before, maybe any concluding consultation and so on this. So I think that's a way for Macron to make one of these very vocal statements, reaffirming European and France's strategic autonomy, not to provoke China, trying to not to be seen only as the follower of the US. But here I think maybe in a second time he might revise his statement and maybe join this kind of initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Céline. I think we all understood, and we will continue listening to the latest developments. And I'll now turn to Jeffrey. You're last in line, and I always remember you as the expert on US-Japan alliances, US alliance-based system in the region from many years ago already. Given all those changes that happened recently that Chris alluded to, not just with US in the middle, but between the US allies among themselves, and now we have the Europeans and NATO on top of it. What do you make of this kind of new security architecture in the making? I think it's a fascinating one.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is thank you to the hosts, and this is a wonderful discussion to be having. To answer your question, I think when we look at the region, the Indo-Pacific region, traditionally the security architecture has been the bilateral alliances, as we all know. And we have had these broader range multilateral groupings like ASEAN, but they have not been focused on security per se. But over the past decade, maybe 2 decades or so, states have begun relying on a third alternative, which is minilaterals. These are essentially these semi-formalized groupings where you have a smaller number of partners and it's formed to advance specific objectives. In the Indo-Pacific, this has gotten a lot of attention recently with things like AUKUS and things like the Quad. But I think there's room here to elaborate, and that's what I'll do with my few minutes here, to briefly talk about this growth in minilaterals, how it brings countries together with shared interests, but importantly, how they provide opportunities for US allies in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, provides them opportunities to collaborate and cooperate in different ways, different from their traditional structures that they have worked with. But importantly, we don't see any of these being used as collective security mechanisms that one could envision as playing an important role in prevention of or planning for contingencies, and I'll touch on that in a little bit as well. But the focus of my talk, sort of the core around which, is really, it's looking at the groupings that involve the United States. This is because the U.S. is often sought after as an actor in these minilateral groupings because of the resources and capabilities that they bring to bear, combined with the U.S. commitment to regional stability, both in Europe and in Indo-Pacific. And quite frankly, lends greater credibility for many of the partners that seek U.S. participation. I'm not suggesting that the only minilaterals that matter are those that involve the United States. There are plenty other of non-U.S. minilaterals out there. Examples include the Australia-France-India trilateral, the India-Indonesia-Australia trilateral, the BRICS, the MICA groupings, and China also has a number of its own minilaterals as well, such as its trilateral with Russia and India, a CT mechanism with Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and of course the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there's others to talk about as well. But when we look at the security-focused minilaterals that involve the United States, we can generally categorize these endeavors into three primary types or buckets. I would categorize these as diplomatic, technical, and operational. And I'll go over briefly what I mean by each of those. The one that gets the most attention is the Quad. Arguably, this is the most well-known, what I would call the diplomatic type of trilateral or a minilateral. As you know, it's a network of 4 countries, and they're united in their strategic commitment to support a free and open Indo-Pacific region via various initiatives. It's not an alliance. They do talk about security, and there's Malabar that has been folded in, but it's not an alliance. The Quad's value is strategic in nature, in that it shapes the environment by laying out a positive, practical agenda that these 4 countries push to respond to some of the region's security challenges. This helps build positive feedback, but it also helps shape the region in very practical ways. But importantly, for our purposes here, the Quad is a venue that can grow. There has been talk about a Quad Plus, where we have potentially European allies plug and play in these initiatives as well. So it is a format that can be expanded from its core in a way that does bridge both the Indo-Pacific and European theaters. The second type of minilateral is the technical type. In this, I think AUKUS is the classic example, but more recently Japan's relationship with the UK and Italy over their future fighter is another one, albeit that doesn't include the US, and I said my focus would be on the US. But when we look at the technical type, what I think the defining characteristic of this is beyond this interest of developing a certain technology that one state is currently lacking. These groups tend to or sometimes promote greater sovereign capability for one's defense industry by providing endeavor. And then the final type is what I would call an operational type. It's more of a catch-all category here, but it is one that we see throughout the region. You think here about trilaterals that the United States and Japan have with Australia, with the ROK. Most recently, we see a Philippines one, US, Japan, and India as well. Now, the trilats, they're all different. They serve different purposes. And so maybe bucketing these as operational minilaterals is a bit of a misnomer. But I think it's accurate to call these operational because a lot of these focus on military activities or defense activities. A common theme is the more defense or military flavor, where you see armed forces from these countries exercising together or training together. Or even in the case of the US-Japan ROC trilateral, there's even a mechanism in place to share sensitive information regarding North Korean missile launches. They also tend to have trilateral defense dialogues, foreign policy dialogues. So they offer closer cooperation with their defense establishments to talk about pressing defense issues, and they do have cooperation that do have operational benefits for their armed forces. So why are the minilaterals important? The U.S. depended on the hub and spokes mechanism for decades. Why suddenly these mini-lats? Well, I think states are engaging in these because it provides like-minded states an opportunity to meet a specific challenge or address a specific issue that's not being addressed by a current format, whether that be a bilateral alliance, whether that be a broader multilateral grouping. It allows them to talk about strategic matters among more like-minded nations, to share the sensitive technical equipment, or to have specific training for their armed forces. What all this says, though, is that the minilaterals, they're flexible. They allow an efficient handling of one's concerns. Sometimes they allow more immediate action than having to go through a big bureaucracy of a big multilateral organization. And so they fill a void where either multilateral venues are too big to act, or bilateral venues are simply too small to be effective. But importantly, especially for this event, and I mentioned at the beginning, these provide opportunities for states across the theaters, from Indo-Pacific to Europe. They provide them avenues to cooperate in ways that maybe they did not have access to before. But let me turn to my final point here, and one that I mentioned at the beginning. Despite all the activity that we see minilaterals doing diplomatically, operationally, and technically, we don't see minilaterals working on collective security. This still remains, it's monopolized by largely these bilateral alliances, or in the case of Europe, NATO. When we think of a possible contingency in Taiwan, or in the region, but involving Taiwan, I believe minilaterals are unlikely to be the venue through which the United States is hoping to prevent or plan for this contingency. Instead, it's still going to be looking at its traditional alliance frameworks, whether that be bilateral in the Indo-Pacific or NATO in the case of Europe. We hear a lot. There's been a lot in the media, improved ties between the U.S. and the Philippines, between the U.S. and Korea, increased defense spending in Japan, more strategically oriented Korea. While much has been made of all that, I still think the best way that these treaty alliances can prepare themselves for regional contingencies and prevent possible hostilities is to build more robust defenses and plan with the United States. And they are doing that. They're doing that, and that is something that we need to applaud. But I think sometimes there's their efforts get conflated with a determination that they're going to defend Taiwan, or that they're on board with U.S. efforts to possibly defend Taiwan. I think sometimes these things get pushed together too much. But still, their efforts are important. And I do think, though, they need to work with the United States, deeper dialogue, better training, better planning. Now, if the minilaterals can help them build trust with one another to start to have those types of discussions, more real like planning discussions, that's great. But I do think at the end of the day, any contingency involving Taiwan is likely to be fought by an ad hoc coalition of states centered around the United States. The minilaterals do have a very important role to play, though, in peacetime, in shaping and helping them with their capabilities. But I do think that if we start to think about if these minilateral frameworks is the future in terms of reacting to contingencies, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get them in the place to where they need to be. But I'll end on some good news, and that's where I think with all these minilaterals, there's room to grow for Indo-Pacific allies and European allies to work together because these are flexible, because states can choose how to engage one another to their liking. The sky's the limit, really. And so the more that European friends and Indo-Pacific friends find common security interests that they want to cooperate on, I think this is the venue that they'll do it. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I personally find this fascinating, this whole minilaterals and how basically cooperation finds its way somehow organically when the structure does not allow it, is an interesting one. And by the way, to your categorization, we could add the functional ones. Mekong River, Malacca Straits Patrol, the ones that are organized against around one concrete result. But back to our subject, we have quite a little time left, some 15-20 minutes. I would like to give a little bit of space also to your questions. So as you think about it, unless you have a burning one, let me ask just one, because we won't have time for one question to each of you. But I thought of just one question to all of you. If you had, and I'm kind of making my life easier thinking ahead of those workshops and 1.5 seminars, if you had a wish list based on your expertise, your backgrounds, of priorities, areas, either geographic or functional, where the where the US and Europe could or should focus on in terms of priorities, what would be yours? 3 would be fine. 1 is already great. If you have more, please, go ahead. Anything that comes at the top of your head would be fine, and then of course we can go through it. But I think it's an interesting exercise to see here live if we already come to agree on some of the key topics. But please, if you have any questions here at the audience, don't hesitate to come up. It's your chance. The microphone is just up there. Any questions? Yeah, I see. No? Okay. All right. Well, if you change your mind, you don't hesitate to raise your hand. I was hoping just to get a little bit of more time to our speakers to think about their wish list. But I can see Yuki is already starting.
I think I'll just start and everybody else can pile on. How's that? To make the list longer. So if I can just insert Japan into the mix, I think there are a number of things that can go onto that wish list, because U.S. and our European partners in Japan, both they all have a different strength, again, in the different parts of the world. So for instance, I think Southeast Asia is where Japan has a little bit of a leg up, given the historical economic engagement based on its development assistance and the approach that it takes, that Japan approaches. So for example, capacity building, or not just in security sector, but just build civil resilience, for example, like resilience in a self-society, disaster-prone. Southeast Asia is also a disaster-prone area as well. So building up those countries' capacity to cope with those large-scale disasters on its own. Japan, as a country, also comes with a lot of natural disasters, has, I guess, experience in terms of building construction method, in terms of against the earthquakes and so forth. But that's where Japan can probably take a step of a lead. But they can definitely participation by U.S. and European partners can definitely be a force multiplier. And I would probably European partners have a little bit of a leg up in Africa. That's where the European partner may have a lead in it, but then U.S. and Japanese participation, again, can be a force multiplier. And it doesn't really, I'm not really just thinking about the traditional defense sector, capacity development, but it's more across the board now, in the age of economic, a border between conventional and non-conventional security is very, very low. And the same thing about Latin America. So I think really, if you think about different country taking a lead in different parts of the world where they have a little bit of a comparative advantage, I think, entire globe is kind of a, Jeffrey said about, sky's the limit, but it really is, entire globe can be their operation of a potential wish list. But then it really matter of, I think what we have to think carefully is which one of us have more of a comparative advantage in different parts of those areas, and how can the rest of the team can function through coordination as a force multiplier.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think definitely on the natural disasters and all the climate change related, I mean, the Europeans would be definitely on the demanding side. Hopefully, connectivity is yet another one, provided that we avoid the competitive element in there as well. Anyone, who's next in line?
Sure, I'll just build a little bit on what Yuki said, because I think there's a lot of good sense there. I think, as I think about areas where at least collaboration, deconfliction, coordination would be useful, support for high quality infrastructure, where the needs are vast. One of the programs that the Quad announced, totally obscured, of course, at the G7 this year, for example, was a new technical assistance program, a scholarship program to train basically civil servants in the Indo-Pacific on how to negotiate, manage infrastructure contracts to help countries essentially to arm them with the capability to ensure they get deals that respect their sovereignty and are financially viable. Huge need, right? And a tremendous way to push back in a positive way, in an affirmative way, and in upholding sort of a rules-based, law-based order. The needs are going to be far greater than what the Quad can support. I can easily see cooperation with European friends and other parts of the world in that kind of space. And then the other one, just to pick up on what Celine was saying about maritime domain awareness. This is, the Quad has a dedicated, focused program to support MDA capabilities. That also is an area of need that exceeds supply, including in the regions where the Quad is working. So I would think that some coordination with European partners in supporting MDA capacity, including in the Indo-Pacific, would be positive.
Excellent. Both relatively low-hanging fruits, I would say. And there's already this partnership that we have with Japan and other countries on high-quality and sustainable infrastructure. So, excellent. Celine, do you want to follow?
Just following up on Chris just said about infrastructure, connectivity, and so on, I think one key topic is also the question of the protection of critical infrastructure, especially undersea cables that are critical in the region. We've seen with the war in Ukraine that it can be easily damaged and with huge consequences. And in the Indo-Pacific region, especially in the Pacific Islands countries, this region, there's a lack of those actually cables. We need more capacity. We need to double the cables so that we are sure that all the region is not in the dark on digital connectivity. So I think this is one promising way to work together, and because I'm looking also at this region of the Pacific Islands, I see some nice, coordination mechanism between France, New Zealand, and Australia, with the France mechanism, which is basically to try to coordinate the capacity in case of natural disasters, so HADR. I think it would be interesting also to plug in some other countries on this, and why not thinking about having a coordination cell for HADR issues, implying also Europeans assets in the region and European expertise. That would be also a nice way maybe to mobilize the coordinated maritime presence concept and try to make the most of the deployment that we have in the region, and also the permanent presence that we have in the region. Because just to to reiterate, France and thus EU have territories in the region, in both Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, and this is a real plus to be able to intervene very quickly in case of any disaster in the region. Yeah.
Thank you. Jeffrey, last word.
Just building off of everyone's comments, I think whether wrongly or rightly, a lot of the countries in Oceania, Southeast Asia, Africa, even in Latin America, they look at U.S. outreach efforts as basically being geopolitical in nature. You're either with us or you're not with us. And again, rightly or wrongly, that's how our own foreign policy sometimes gets interpreted. But and all of you know that these countries do not necessarily want to choose sides. They see benefits from having a good relationship with U.S. and China. And so I think that, you know, even though I just sat up here talking about security, I think if we put security aside, there's a lot of areas where the U.S. and Europe could cooperate. And again, some of these have already been mentioned, but if we look at things like, you know, like Chris was talking about the high quality infrastructure, Celine about the digital connectivity, there's just basic things that a lot of these countries need. And US or Europe alone cannot do this. The more resources that can be brought to bear, it's, you know, the tide that lifts all boats here. But there's a whole host of other things, the climate change, environmental efforts, global health efforts, fisheries. There's a whole host of things that if the US and Europe can pool their resources, pool their expertise, pool their training ability to bring, you know, dispatch experts to the region, I think that soft power would serve more, have more influence on a lot of these countries than maybe just having a diplomat show up and say, you know, China's bad. But then I think the final thing, and again, if we do start to seep into security assistance, you know, the maritime domain awareness is critical. I know for those of us who are security minded, we tend to think more about, well, we want to make sure we know where the adversary ships are. But for most countries, they want to know where the illegal fishing ships are because they're stealing critical resources from their waters. And so the more that the US and Europe can help with maybe Coast Guard training, even basic things like meteorological training. I know Japan has an effort, the self-defense forces train other governments, meteorological agencies to learn how to read weather patterns in a more you know, routine manner. Things like that we tend to take for granted could really pay dividends in a lot of these countries around the world. I'll stop there.
Thanks. I know Chris had 2 fingers.
Yeah, just to build on what's been said here, I mean, I think there's the affirmative agenda that we should seek to build for what we can offer to the region and beyond. Then there's the conversation that we ought to be able to have behind closed doors together about deterrence and how we prevent and respond to crises. And that's where I think the AP4 connection to NATO becomes important, to align, to share information, to align strategic perspectives, to try to come to shared understandings of what we're seeing in Russian activity, what we're seeing in Chinese activity, and then what we're going to do about it. And that conversation doesn't have to take place in public. It could be behind closed doors, but it's a pretty important part of our agenda, I think, and as I tried to suggest in my remarks, it ought to include both sort of diplomatic and military efforts, but there's also the discussion about economic tools and how we can bring those to bear, both as a deterrent measure and also as a response measure. So I think there are sort of 2 parts to our agenda going forward, right? There's the affirmative, outward-looking engagement with the region, and then there's the behind closed doors strategic alignment, where we determine how we're going to work together to prevent really bad things from happening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. Actually, if you didn't step in, that was actually the point I was trying to make, because it was interesting, the décalage a little bit between what we all started talking about, which was security defense, and then the wishing lists finally skewing towards the much more soft security issues that were really not even discussed in the initial remarks apart from Celine. And there, I was wondering what happened exactly with contingency planning, what happened about really seriously discussing resources, defense industrial cooperation, all those things that also have a legitimate place among the discussion. And also, I think we forgot the multilateralism. Multilateralism is not completely dead. Quite a few topics actually that we raised, including climate, including undersea cables, are actually discussed in settings where both Japan, Europe, and US is present. And I'm thinking of the ASEAN Regional Forum, for instance, or even some of the UN level, G7, etc. So there are multiple levels, and we can probably come up with a very nice draft or graph to kind of bring all these perspectives together. A lot of homework to be taken back to Europe, and I'm looking forward to continuing working with our colleagues at the CSIS and in the US and in Japan and across the region. The future looks interesting, promising for transatlantic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and I think we're in the best possible venue to continue exploring this. So I'll end this session here. Thank you very much for joining us. Many thanks again to CSIS.